Genesis chapter 21 verse 1. And the Lord visited Sarah as he had said, and the Lord did unto Sarah as he had spoken. This verse is a significant turning point in the story of Abraham and Sarah, as it marks the fulfillment of God's promise to give them a son. To understand the context and significance of Genesis chapter 21 verse 1, let's explore the broader narrative leading up to this point. Abraham and Sarah had been married for many years, but Sarah was unable to conceive a child. God had made a covenant with Abraham, promising to bless him and make him the father of a great nation, Genesis chapter 12 verses 1 through 3, chapter 15 verses 1 through 6. However, as the years passed without a child, Sarah grew impatient and suggested that Abraham have a child with her maidservant, Hagar, Genesis chapter 16 verses 1 through 3. Abraham agreed, and Hagar gave birth to a son named Ishmael. 13 years later, when Abraham was 99 years old and Sarah was 90, God appeared to Abraham and reaffirmed his promise, declaring that Sarah would bear a son, Genesis chapter 17 verses 15 through 19. Sarah overheard this conversation and laughed in disbelief, considering her old age and the fact that Abraham was also advanced in years. But God responded by saying, "Is anything too hard for the Lord?" Genesis chapter 18 verse 14. In Genesis chapter 21 verse 1, we see the culmination of God's promise to Abraham and Sarah. It begins with the statement, "And the Lord visited Sarah as he had said." This visitation refers to God's intervention in Sarah's life to bring about the promised birth. It is a reminder that God is faithful to his word and will fulfill his promises. The verse continues, "And the Lord did unto Sarah as he had spoken." Here, we see the power of God's spoken word. He spoke the promise of a son to Abraham, and now, in his perfect timing, he brings it to pass. This emphasizes the authority and reliability of God's spoken word. What God declares, he fulfills. Genesis chapter 21 verses 2 through 7 further describes the birth of Sarah's son. Sarah conceives and gives birth to Isaac, whose name means laughter. Sarah acknowledges that God has brought her laughter, stating, "God hath made me to laugh, so that all that hear will laugh with me." Genesis chapter 21 verse 6. This chapter marks a significant milestone in God's plan of redemption, as Isaac becomes the child of promise, the seed through whom God's covenant with Abraham will be carried forward. Isaac's birth illustrates God's faithfulness to his promises, even when circumstances seem impossible. It also underscores the truth that nothing is too difficult for God. In summary, Genesis chapter 21 verse 1 is a pivotal verse in the story of Abraham and Sarah, highlighting the fulfillment of God's promise to give them a son. It reminds us of God's faithfulness, his power to bring about the impossible, and the importance of trusting in his word. Genesis chapter 21 verse 2. For Sarah conceived, and bare Abraham a son in his old age, at the set time of which God had spoken to him. Context: Genesis chapter 21 is a significant chapter in the book of Genesis as it marks the fulfillment of God's promise to Abraham and Sarah. The previous chapter, Genesis chapter 20, tells the story of Abraham's encounter with Abimelech, where he deceives Abimelech by saying Sarah is his sister instead of his wife. Despite Abraham's lack of trust and questionable actions, God remains faithful to his promises. The promise: God had promised Abraham and Sarah a son in their old age. This promise was initially given in Genesis chapter 15 verses 4 and 5 and reiterated in Genesis chapter 17 verse 19, where God specifically mentions that Sarah will bear a son. At the time, both Abraham and Sarah were well advanced in years, and Sarah had been barren throughout her life. Sarah's conception, Genesis chapter 21 verse 2, highlights the miraculous fulfillment of God's promise. Sarah conceives and bears a son to Abraham, even though they were both well past the age of childbearing. This miraculous birth demonstrates God's power to fulfill his promises, regardless of human limitations and impossibilities. God's faithfulness, The phrase, "at the set time of which God had spoken to him," emphasizes the precision and faithfulness of God's timing. God had given Abraham a specific timeframe for the fulfillment of his promise. Despite the passing of many years and the doubts that may have arisen, God fulfills his promise precisely when he said he would. This underscores the reliability and trustworthiness of God's word. Lessons to learn. God's promises are certain. This verse reminds us that God's promises never fail. Even when circumstances seem impossible, God is able to accomplish what he has spoken. God's timing is perfect. God operates according to his own timeline, which may differ from our expectations. We need to trust in his perfect timing, knowing that he will fulfill his promises at the appointed time. God's faithfulness outweighs human limitations. Despite Abraham and Sarah's old age and Sarah's infertility, God's faithfulness prevails. Our limitations and weaknesses do not hinder God's ability to bring about his plans. Application. Trust in God's promises. Like Abraham and Sarah, we should trust in God's promises, even when they seem impossible or take longer than expected to be fulfilled. Wait patiently for God's timing. It's essential to wait patiently for God's timing, knowing that he will fulfill his promises at the perfect moment. Impatience can lead to compromises and missed blessings. Embrace God's faithfulness. Reflect on how God has been faithful in your life. Remember his past faithfulness to strengthen your faith in the present and future. In summary, Genesis chapter 21 verse 2 is a powerful verse that highlights God's faithfulness in fulfilling his promises. It reminds us to trust in his promises, wait patiently for his timing, and embrace his faithfulness, even in seemingly impossible situations. Genesis chapter 21 verse 3, "And Abraham called the name of his son that was born unto him, whom Sarah bare to him, Isaac." Genesis chapter 21 verse 3 is a significant verse in the biblical narrative as it marks the birth of Isaac, the long-awaited son of Abraham and Sarah. To fully appreciate the context and significance of this verse, let's explore the surrounding verses and the broader themes within the book of Genesis. The book of Genesis is the first book of the Bible and serves as the foundation for the entire biblical narrative. It provides an account of the origins of the world, humanity, and God's covenant with his chosen people. Within Genesis, the story of Abraham occupies a prominent place. At this point in the narrative, Abraham and Sarah have been waiting for many years for the fulfillment of God's promise to give them a child. Despite their old age, God miraculously intervenes and allows Sarah to conceive and give birth to a son, whom they name Isaac. The name Isaac means "he laughs" or laughter. It is significant because it reflects the joy and laughter that filled Abraham and Sarah's lives when they finally received the long-awaited gift of a child. The name serves as a reminder of God's faithfulness in fulfilling his promises. This event holds profound theological implications. It demonstrates God's power to accomplish the impossible and his faithfulness to his covenant with Abraham. Isaac's birth is a miraculous fulfillment of God's promise to make Abraham the father of many nations, Genesis chapter 17 verses 4 through 6. Furthermore, Isaac's birth sets the stage for future events and themes in the Bible. Isaac becomes a crucial figure in the Abrahamic covenant and plays a significant role in God's redemptive plan for humanity. He is a foreshadowing of Jesus Christ, who would come as the ultimate fulfillment of God's promises and the Savior of the world. Genesis chapter 21 verse 3 emphasizes the joy and gratitude experienced by Abraham and Sarah upon the birth of their long-awaited son. It serves as a reminder of God's faithfulness, his ability to work miracles, and his sovereignty over human circumstances. The birth of Isaac marks a pivotal moment in biblical history and sets the stage for the unfolding of God's plan of redemption. As with any biblical passage, it is essential to study the surrounding verses and consider the broader themes of the Bible to gain a more comprehensive understanding of the significance and implications of a particular verse. Genesis chapter 21 verse 4, "And Abraham circumcised his son Isaac being 8 days old, as God had commanded him." This verse is part of the narrative describing the birth of Isaac, the long-awaited son of Abraham and Sarah. It highlights an important event in the life of Isaac when he was circumcised according to God's command. Context. To better understand Genesis chapter 21 verse 4, it is important to consider the context of the passage. In Genesis chapter 17, God established a covenant with Abraham, promising to make him the father of many nations. As a sign of this covenant, God commanded Abraham to circumcise himself, his household, and all future male descendants on the 8th day after their birth. Genesis chapter 17 verses 10 through 14. The circumcision was a physical mark of the covenant relationship between God and Abraham's descendants. Abraham's obedience. Genesis chapter 21 verse 4 highlights Abraham's obedience to God's command. Despite being 100 years old at the time, Abraham faithfully circumcised his son Isaac when he was 8 days old. This act demonstrates Abraham's trust and submission to God's instructions. He followed God's covenant faithfully, recognizing its importance and keeping it as a symbol of his relationship with God. Significance of circumcision. Circumcision held both physical and spiritual significance in the Old Testament. Physically, it involved the removal of the foreskin of the male reproductive organ. Spiritually, it served as a sign of God's covenant with Abraham and his descendants. Circumcision set apart the Israelites as a distinct people, signifying their obedience and commitment to God. Foreshadowing the covenant. The act of circumcision foreshadowed the greater spiritual covenant that God would establish through Jesus Christ. In the New Testament, circumcision is no longer required as a physical practice for believers in Jesus Christ. Instead, the emphasis is on the circumcision of the heart, a spiritual transformation brought about by faith in Christ. Romans chapter 2 verses 28 through 29. Through Jesus, both Jews and Gentiles can become partakers of the new covenant, which is based on faith and not on physical rituals. In conclusion, Genesis chapter 21 verse 4 portrays Abraham's obedience to God's command to circumcise his son Isaac on the 8th day. This act signifies Abraham's faithfulness and submission to God's covenant. Circumcision, in the Old Testament, served as a physical mark of the covenant relationship between God and Abraham's descendants. Ultimately, circumcision foreshadowed the greater spiritual covenant made possible through Jesus Christ, where the focus shifted to the circumcision of the heart and faith in him. Genesis chapter 21 verse 5. And Abraham was 100 years old, when his son Isaac was born unto him. This verse marks a significant milestone in the life of Abraham and Sarah, demonstrating God's faithfulness and fulfillment of his promises. Let's explore the context and themes surrounding Genesis chapter 21 verse 5. The promise of God. Genesis chapter 21 verse 5 highlights the fulfillment of God's promise to Abraham and Sarah. God had promised them that they would have a son, and despite their old age and Sarah's barrenness, Isaac was born to them. This serves as a testament to God's faithfulness and his ability to bring about the fulfillment of his word, even when circumstances seem impossible. The faith and obedience of Abraham. Abraham's obedience to God is a recurring theme throughout the book of Genesis. Despite his doubts and moments of uncertainty, Abraham remained faithful to God's call. In this particular instance, Abraham's faith is evident as he trusted in God's promise and patiently waited for the fulfillment of the covenant. His obedience to God's command to father a child at his old age demonstrates his unwavering faith. The miracle of birth. The birth of Isaac is seen as a miraculous event due to Abraham and Sarah's advanced age. Sarah had been barren throughout her life, but God intervened and enabled her to conceive and bear a child in her old age. This emphasizes that nothing is impossible with God, and he has the power to bring forth life and fulfill his purposes in unexpected ways. Symbolism of Isaac. Isaac's birth holds symbolic significance within the larger narrative of the Bible. Isaac was the promised child through whom God's covenant and blessings would continue. He serves as a foreshadowing of Christ, as his miraculous birth points forward to the birth of Jesus, who would bring salvation to the world. Overall, Genesis chapter 21 verse 5 is a pivotal verse that highlights God's faithfulness, Abraham's obedience, the miracle of Isaac's birth, and the fulfillment of God's promises. It encourages us to trust in God's faithfulness, even in seemingly impossible situations, and reminds us that God has the power to bring about His plans and purposes in our lives. Genesis chapter 21 verse 6. And Sarah said, God hath made me to laugh, so that all that hear will laugh with me. This verse is part of the account of the birth of Isaac, the promised son to Abraham and Sarah. Sarah had been barren for many years, but God fulfilled His promise to them by enabling Sarah to conceive and give birth to a son in her old age. Isaac's birth was a miraculous event, and it brought great joy and laughter to Sarah. Sarah's laughter. The laughter mentioned in this verse is significant because it reflects Sarah's initial reaction when she first heard that she would bear a child in her old age. In Genesis chapter 18 verse 12, when the three visitors, who were actually angels, informed Abraham about the upcoming birth, Sarah overheard and laughed to herself, saying, After I am worn out, and my Lord is old, shall I have pleasure? Sarah found it amusing and even impossible to imagine such a thing happening at her age. God's faithfulness. Despite Sarah's initial doubt and laughter, God fulfilled His promise to Abraham and Sarah. The birth of Isaac was a testament to God's faithfulness and power. It demonstrated that nothing is impossible for God, and He can bring about His plans and promises in unexpected ways. Sarah's laughter of disbelief turned into laughter of joy and astonishment when Isaac was born. Shared joy. When Sarah said, So that all that hear will laugh with me, she expressed her desire for others to share in her joy and celebration. The birth of Isaac was not only a personal blessing for Sarah and Abraham, but also a cause for rejoicing among their community. It was a testimony to God's faithfulness and a reminder that He can do extraordinary things. This verse serves as a reminder of God's faithfulness in fulfilling His promises, even when they seem unlikely or impossible. It encourages us to trust in God's plan and timing, knowing that He is able to bring about His purposes in our lives. Sarah's laughter reminds us that God can turn our doubts into joy, and our disbelief into amazement when we witness His faithfulness. It also highlights the power of shared joy and the importance of inviting others to join in celebrating God's goodness. Genesis chapter 21 verse 7. And she said, Who would have said unto Abraham, that Sarah should have given children suck? For I have borne him a son in his old age. This verse is part of the account of the birth of Isaac, the promised son of Abraham and Sarah. To fully understand its significance, let's explore the context and key themes. Context. In Genesis chapter 12, God made a covenant with Abraham, promising to bless him, make him a great nation, and give him a land. God also promised that all nations would be blessed through him. However, as years went by, Abraham and Sarah remained childless, even though they were well advanced in age. This caused doubt and led him to consider alternative solutions, such as Sarah giving her maidservant, Hagar, to Abraham as a wife, resulting in the birth of Ishmael, Genesis chapter 16. The promise fulfilled. Despite Abraham and Sarah's doubts and the mistakes they made along the way, God remained faithful to His promise. In Genesis chapter 17, God renewed His covenant with Abraham and promised that Sarah would bear a son, even in her old age. When Sarah initially heard this, she laughed in disbelief, Genesis chapter 18 verse 12. However, God fulfilled His promise, and Sarah conceived and bore a son named Isaac, Genesis chapter 21 verses 1 through 3. Sarah's response. Genesis chapter 21 verse 7 captures Sarah's joyful and amazed response to the birth of Isaac. She expresses astonishment that she, an old woman, has given birth to a son. Sarah recognizes the miraculous nature of Isaac's birth and marvels at God's faithfulness. Her question, Who would have said unto Abraham, that Sarah should have given children suck, reflects her awareness of the unexpected and unlikely nature of this event. Lessons and applications. God's faithfulness. Genesis chapter 21 verse 7 reminds us of God's faithfulness in fulfilling His promises, even when circumstances seem impossible. God remains true to His word and can bring about the fulfillment of His plans in unexpected ways and at unexpected times. God's timing. Isaac's birth occurred in Sarah's old age, emphasizing that God's timing is perfect. He fulfills His promises at the appointed time, and His plans are not hindered by human limitations or doubts. God's power over the impossible. Sarah's ability to bear a child in her old age showcases God's power and ability to bring forth life from what appears to be lifeless or barren situations. It reminds us that God can accomplish the impossible, and His power is not limited by human constraints. The joy of God's fulfillment. Sarah's joy and amazement at Isaac's birth highlight the blessings and joy that come from experiencing God's faithfulness and the fulfillment of His promises. It serves as a reminder to celebrate and give thanks when God accomplishes His purposes in our lives. In summary, Genesis chapter 21 verse 7 captures Sarah's astonishment and joy at giving birth to Isaac in her old age. It reminds us of God's faithfulness, His ability to fulfill His promises in His perfect timing, and His power to bring forth life from seemingly impossible situations. It encourages us to trust in God's faithfulness and celebrate His works in our lives. Genesis chapter 21 verse 8. And the child grew, and was weaned, and Abraham made a great feast the same day that Isaac was weaned. This verse is part of the larger narrative of the life of Abraham, his wife Sarah, and their son Isaac. Let's delve into the context and explore the significance of this particular verse. Genesis chapter 21 recounts the fulfillment of God's promise to Abraham and Sarah, who were advanced in age and had been barren. God miraculously enabled Sarah to conceive and give birth to a son, Isaac, in their old age. This event was a testament to God's faithfulness and His power to bring about the impossible. In verse 8, we learn that Isaac grew and was weaned. Weaning typically took place around the age of 2 or 3 years in ancient times. Weaning marked a significant milestone in a child's life when they transitioned from being solely dependent on their mother's milk to being introduced to solid food. It was a time of celebration and joy for the family. Abraham, being a proud and grateful father, decided to commemorate Isaac's weaning by hosting a great feast. This feast was likely a festive occasion where family and friends gathered together to rejoice and give thanks for the birth and growth of Isaac. It was a way for Abraham to honor God's faithfulness in fulfilling His promise and to share his joy with others. Beyond the surface level, this verse holds some symbolic and foreshadowing elements. Isaac's birth and subsequent weaning can be seen as a precursor to the greater story of God's redemptive plan for humanity. Isaac, as the promised child, represents the beginning of the lineage through which God would eventually bring forth the Messiah, Jesus Christ. The feast that Abraham hosts can be seen as a foreshadowing of the spiritual banquet that God prepares for His people. In the New Testament, Jesus speaks of a heavenly banquet, often referred to as the wedding feast of the Lamb, which signifies the ultimate celebration and union between Christ and His bride, the Church. Genesis chapter 21 verse 8 reminds us of the joy that comes from God's faithfulness in fulfilling His promises. It encourages us to celebrate and give thanks for the blessings we receive, recognizing that every good and perfect gift comes from God. James chapter 1 verse 17. It also points us to the ultimate fulfillment of God's redemptive plan through Jesus Christ, inviting us to partake in the spiritual feast and eternal joy found in Him. In summary, Genesis chapter 21 verse 8 captures the moment when Isaac was weaned, marking a significant milestone in his life. Abraham celebrated this occasion by hosting a great feast, showcasing his gratitude and joy for God's faithfulness in fulfilling His promise. This verse holds both literal and symbolic significance, pointing to the greater story of God's redemptive plan and inviting us to rejoice in His blessings. Genesis chapter 21 verse 9. And Sarah saw the son of Hagar the Egyptian, which she had borne unto Abraham, mocking. Genesis chapter 21 verse 9 is a significant verse in the story of Abraham, Sarah, and their son Isaac. To fully understand its context, let's explore the preceding events. In the earlier chapters of Genesis, God had promised Abraham and Sarah that they would have a son, despite their old age. However, as the years went by without any sign of the promised child, Sarah became impatient. She suggested to Abraham that he should have a child with her maidservant, Hagar, in order to fulfill God's promise. Abraham agreed to Sarah's proposal and had a son with Hagar named Ishmael. However, this arrangement caused tensions within the household. When Sarah finally conceived and gave birth to Isaac, the long-awaited promised child, she insisted that Abraham cast out Hagar and Ishmael. In Genesis chapter 21 verse 9, Sarah sees Ishmael, the son of Hagar, mocking or playing with Isaac. The exact nature of Ishmael's behavior is not explicitly described, but it seems to have been disrespectful or derisive in some way. Sarah's response to seeing Ishmael mocking Isaac is significant because it reveals her concern for Isaac's place as the rightful heir of Abraham's inheritance and the fulfillment of God's promise. She sees Ishmael as a threat to Isaac's position and perceives his actions as an act of disrespect. This incident leads Sarah to request Abraham to cast out Hagar and Ishmael from their household. Abraham initially hesitates, but God reassures him and advises him to listen to Sarah. So, with a heavy heart, Abraham sends Hagar and Ishmael away, providing them with some provisions for their journey. This event has broader implications in the biblical narrative. It marks a pivotal moment in God's covenant with Abraham. Isaac, the son of promise, is affirmed as the chosen heir through whom God's covenant will be fulfilled. Meanwhile, Ishmael becomes the ancestor of a great nation according to God's promise, but is not the chosen recipient of the covenant. This passage illustrates the consequences of human choices and highlights the importance of faith and patience in waiting for God's promises to be fulfilled. It also demonstrates the complexities of human relationships and the challenges that arise when we try to fulfill God's promises through our own plans. Overall, Genesis chapter 21 verse 9 serves as a turning point in the story of Abraham's family, leading to the establishment of the line of promise through Isaac while acknowledging the significance of Ishmael's lineage. Genesis chapter 21 verse 10. Wherefore she said unto Abraham, Cast out this bondwoman and her son, for the son of this bondwoman shall not be heir with my son, even with Isaac. This verse is part of the narrative in Genesis that describes the birth of Isaac, the promised son of Abraham and Sarah. Prior to Isaac's birth, Sarah had been unable to conceive, so she suggested that Abraham father a child with her maidservant, Hagar. As a result, Ishmael was born to Hagar. However, after Sarah miraculously conceived and gave birth to Isaac, tensions arose within the household. In this particular verse, Sarah expresses her frustration and concern to Abraham regarding Ishmael's place in their family. She insists that Ishmael and his mother, Hagar, be cast out, emphasizing that Ishmael should not be considered an heir alongside Isaac. This request by Sarah reflects her desire to secure Isaac's position as the sole inheritor of Abraham's blessings and promises from God. The context of this passage reveals the complexities and challenges faced by Abraham's family. It highlights the consequences of their attempts to fulfill God's promise through their own efforts, rather than trusting in His timing and plan. The birth of Ishmael through Hagar was a result of Sarah and Abraham's impatience, and it caused division and tension within their household. It's important to note that this passage should not be seen as an endorsement of mistreatment or abandonment of individuals, as it is specific to the circumstances of Abraham, Sarah, Hagar, and Ishmael. Rather, it serves as a historical account of the events that transpired in the lives of these individuals and the complexities that arose from their actions. Overall, Genesis chapter 21 verse 10 reveals the consequences of Abraham and Sarah's decision to involve Hagar in their quest for a child, as well as Sarah's concern for Isaac's inheritance and the subsequent request to remove Hagar and Ishmael from their household. Genesis chapter 21 verse 11. And the thing was very grievous in Abraham's sight because of his son. Genesis chapter 21 verse 11 is part of the narrative that describes the events surrounding the birth of Isaac, the promised son of Abraham and Sarah. This verse reveals Abraham's reaction to Sarah's demand that he cast out Hagar, the mother of Ishmael, and her son Ishmael. To fully understand the significance of this verse, it is helpful to provide some context. In Genesis chapter 16, we learn that Sarah, who was barren, allowed her husband Abraham to have a child with her Egyptian maidservant, Hagar. Hagar became pregnant and gave birth to Ishmael. However, Sarah became jealous and mistreated Hagar, leading her to flee into the wilderness. In Genesis chapter 17, God reaffirms his promise to Abraham that he would have a son through Sarah, and that the covenant would be established with him. In Genesis chapter 21, God fulfills his promise to Abraham and Sarah, and they have a son named Isaac in their old age. Sarah's joy at the birth of her son is evident in Genesis chapter 21 verse 6 when she says, "God hath made me to laugh, so that all that hear will laugh with me." This verse contrasts with the situation that arises in Genesis chapter 21 verses 9 and 10. In Genesis chapter 21 verses 9 and 10, Sarah observes Ishmael mocking Isaac, possibly due to jealousy or rivalry. This distresses Sarah, and she demands that Abraham cast out Hagar and Ishmael, saying, "Cast out this bondwoman and her son, for the son of this bondwoman shall not be heir with my son, even with Isaac." Genesis chapter 21 verse 11 captures Abraham's reaction to Sarah's demand. It describes his response as very grievous, indicating that he was deeply troubled by the situation. Abraham's grief can be understood from various perspectives. Fatherly love. Abraham had a deep affection for Ishmael, whom he had raised as his own son. The prospect of sending away his child would naturally cause him great distress. Conflict of loyalties. Abraham was torn between his loyalty to Sarah, his wife, and his concern for Ishmael. Sarah's demand put him in a difficult position, as he loved both his wife and his son. God's promise. Abraham may have also experienced anguish because casting out Ishmael would seem to contradict God's earlier promise to bless Ishmael and make him a great nation, Genesis chapter 17 verse 20. Abraham may have wondered how this promise would be fulfilled if Ishmael was sent away. Ultimately, despite his anguish, Abraham obeys God's command and sends Hagar and Ishmael away. God reassures Abraham in Genesis chapter 21 verse 12, saying, "And God said unto Abraham, Let it not be grievous in thy sight because of the lad, and because of thy bondwoman. In all that Sarah hath said unto thee, hearken unto her voice. For in Isaac shall thy seed be called." God confirms his plan for the covenant to be established through Isaac, while also promising to bless and make a great nation of Ishmael. Genesis chapter 21 verse 11 serves as a poignant reminder of the complex emotions and challenges faced by Abraham as he navigates the tension between his family relationships and God's promises. It highlights the human struggle between personal desires, love for family, and obedience to God's will. Ultimately, this passage emphasizes the importance of trust and faith in God's plan, even when it requires difficult decisions and sacrifices. Genesis chapter 21 verse 12. And God said unto Abraham, Let it not be grievous in thy sight because of the lad, and because of thy bondwoman. In all that Sarah hath said unto thee, hearken unto her voice. For in Isaac shall thy seed be called. This verse is a part of the narrative surrounding the birth of Isaac, the promised son of Abraham and Sarah. It reveals an important interaction between God and Abraham regarding the fate of Ishmael, the son born to Abraham through his wife's maidservant, Hagar. In this verse, God instructs Abraham not to be distressed about Hagar and Ishmael, despite Sarah's earlier insistence that Abraham should cast him out. God acknowledges Sarah's words and advises Abraham to listen to her. However, the main emphasis of God's message is that through Isaac, Abraham's true descendants will be called. This verse highlights a few significant points. God's concern for Abraham. Despite Abraham's affection for Ishmael, God reassures him that he is mindful of the situation and advises him not to be burdened by it. Respect for Sarah's words. God affirms that Abraham should hearken to Sarah's voice, indicating the importance of honoring the perspectives and opinions of one's spouse. God recognizes the authority of the husband as the head of the family, but also emphasizes the value of considering the insights and wishes of the wife. The establishment of Isaac's lineage. God declares that Isaac will be the one through whom Abraham's descendants will be called. This confirms the fulfillment of God's promise to bless Abraham with a son from Sarah, who will become the father of a great nation. This verse also sets the stage for the subsequent events in the lives of Abraham, Sarah, Ishmael, and Isaac, which demonstrate God's faithfulness to His promises and His sovereign plan for the chosen lineage. Genesis chapter 21 verse 13. And also of the son of the bondwoman will I make a nation, because he is thy seed. This verse is part of the narrative in the book of Genesis that tells the story of Abraham, Sarah, and Hagar. To better understand the significance of Genesis chapter 21 verse 13, let's explore the context leading up to this verse. In Genesis chapter 12, God called Abraham, originally named Abram, to leave his homeland and promised to make him a great nation, bless him, and make his name great. God also promised to bless those who blessed Abraham and curse those who cursed him. Abraham obeyed God and journeyed to the land of Canaan. In Genesis chapter 15, God made a covenant with Abraham, reaffirming his promise to give him offspring who would become a great nation. However, as time went on, Sarah, Abraham's wife, was unable to conceive. In an attempt to fulfill God's promise, Sarah gave her Egyptian maidservant, Hagar, to Abraham as a wife. Abraham had a son named Ishmael with Hagar, but this was not the child of promise. In Genesis chapter 17, God appeared to Abraham again and established a covenant with him. God changed Abram's name to Abraham, which means father of many nations. God declared that he would bless Sarah and give her a son, and this child would be the one through whom the covenant would continue. Abraham was 99 years old, and Sarah was 90 at this time. In Genesis chapter 18, 3 men, who were actually angels, appeared to Abraham and reaffirmed the promise of a son to Sarah. They set a specific time frame for the birth of the child, indicating that Sarah's barrenness would no longer be an obstacle for God. In Genesis chapter 21, we see the fulfillment of God's promise to Abraham and Sarah. Isaac, the long-awaited child of promise, is born to Sarah in her old age. This event brings great joy to Abraham and Sarah exclaims, God hath made me to laugh, so that all that hear will laugh with me. Genesis chapter 21 verse 6, KJV. However, tension arises between Sarah and Hagar after Isaac's birth. Sarah notices that Ishmael, Hagar's son, is mocking or playing with Isaac. Disturbed by this, Sarah asks Abraham to cast out Hagar and Ishmael, saying that Ishmael shall not be heir with Isaac. This greatly distressed Abraham. In verse 12, God reassures Abraham that Sarah's demand should be obeyed, saying, In all that Sarah hath said unto thee, hearken unto her voice, for in Isaac shall thy seed be called. Genesis chapter 21 verse 12, KJV. This statement affirms that Isaac is the child of promise and that through him, Abraham's descendants will be called. It emphasizes the unique role Isaac will play in continuing God's covenant and establishing a chosen nation. Genesis chapter 21 verse 13, the verse in question, follows immediately after God's reassurance to Abraham. It states, And also of the son of the bondwoman will I make a nation, because he is thy seed. Genesis chapter 21 verse 13, KJV. Here, God acknowledges the presence of Ishmael and assures Abraham that even though Ishmael is not the child of promise, he will also be the father of a great nation because he is Abraham's seed. This verse demonstrates God's mercy and compassion. While Isaac is chosen as the child through whom God's covenant will continue, God does not abandon Ishmael or Hagar. He promises to make a nation out of Ishmael as well. This prophecy is fulfilled as Ishmael becomes the father of 12 princes and a great nation, known as the Ishmaelites. Genesis chapter 21 verse 13 also highlights the broader theme of God's faithfulness to his promises. Despite the complexities and challenges that arise due to human decisions, God remains true to his word. He ensures that his purposes are fulfilled and that his blessings extend beyond the immediate chosen lineage. In summary, Genesis chapter 21 verse 13 emphasizes God's commitment to his covenant with Abraham. While Isaac is the child of promise, God promises to make a nation out of Ishmael as well. This verse reveals God's faithfulness to his promises and demonstrates his compassion for all of Abraham's descendants. Genesis chapter 21 verse 14. Genesis chapter 21 verse 14, KJV, states, "And Abraham rose up early in the morning, and took bread, and a bottle of water, and gave it unto Hagar, putting it on her shoulder, and the child, and sent her away. And she departed, and wandered in the wilderness of Beersheba." Context. To better understand the significance of Genesis chapter 21 verse 14, it's essential to examine the context of the passage. In Genesis chapter 21, we find the account of the birth of Isaac, the promised son of Abraham and Sarah. After many years of waiting, God fulfilled his promise to give them a child in their old age. Ishmael, the son of Hagar, Sarah's maidservant, was also part of their household. Hagar's departure. In this verse, we see Abraham's response to Sarah's insistence that Hagar and her son Ishmael be sent away. Sarah was concerned that Ishmael, being the son of a maidservant, would not share in the inheritance with Isaac. Abraham, although distressed, complied with Sarah's demand. Abraham's provision. When Abraham rose early in the morning, he prepared bread and a bottle of water for Hagar to take with her on their journey. This act demonstrates Abraham's concern for Hagar's well-being and his desire to provide for her and her son as they set out into the wilderness. Wilderness of Beersheba. After receiving provisions from Abraham, Hagar and Ishmael departed and wandered in the wilderness of Beersheba. The wilderness was a barren and desolate place, highlighting the challenging circumstances Hagar and her son faced. Lessons and applications. God's provision. Even though Hagar and Ishmael were sent away, God did not abandon them. He provided them with bread and water through Abraham's hands. This shows God's compassionate nature, even in difficult situations. Obedience to authority. Abraham's willingness to comply with Sarah's request, although challenging for him, reflects a sense of obedience to his wife and her concerns. This passage can serve as a reminder to honor and respect our marital relationships and the importance of unity. God's faithfulness. This verse reminds us of God's faithfulness in fulfilling his promises. Although the circumstances may not always align with our expectations, we can trust that God remains faithful and provides for his people, even in the wilderness experiences of life. Overall, Genesis chapter 21 verse 14 emphasizes the compassion of God and the obedience of Abraham, while also revealing God's faithfulness and provision for those who find themselves in challenging circumstances. Genesis chapter 21 verse 15. "And the water was spent in the bottle, and she cast the child under one of the shrubs." This verse is a part of the narrative in Genesis that recounts the events surrounding the birth of Isaac and the subsequent departure of Hagar and Ishmael from Abraham's household. To gain a better understanding of Genesis chapter 21 verse 15, it is helpful to examine the context and the broader story. In Genesis chapter 21, we learn that Sarah, Abraham's wife, had finally conceived and given birth to a son named Isaac, as God had promised. This brought great joy to Abraham and Sarah, as Isaac was the child of the covenant and the long-awaited heir. However, this event also led to tension and conflict in the household. When Isaac was weaned, Sarah noticed Ishmael, the son of Hagar, mocking him. This upset Sarah, and she demanded that Abraham cast out Hagar and Ishmael, saying that Ishmael should not share in the inheritance with Isaac. Although this request greatly distressed Abraham, God assured him that he would also make a great nation from Ishmael. In Genesis chapter 21 verse 14, Abraham rose early in the morning, took bread and a bottle of water, and gave them to Hagar, placing them on her shoulder. He also sent her away along with Ishmael. At first, it seems that Abraham had made provision for Hagar and Ishmael, supplying them with sustenance for their journey. However, as the verse in question, Genesis chapter 21 verse 15, reveals, the water in the bottle was soon depleted. In a state of desperation, Hagar found herself in the wilderness with her young son, and as their water supply ran out, she cast the child under one of the shrubs, unable to bear witnessing his suffering. This verse highlights the intense suffering and vulnerability that Hagar and Ishmael faced. The harshness of their circumstances led Hagar to believe that death was imminent, and in her anguish, she placed Ishmael under a shrub, likely to seek shade from the scorching desert sun or to protect him from the elements. However, it is crucial to note that this act by Hagar was not an act of intentional harm or abandonment. Instead, it was an expression of her despair and helplessness in a desperate situation. She was a mother who loved her child and could not bear to see him suffer. Genesis chapter 21 verse 15 also serves as a turning point in the story, as it leads to God's intervention and provision for Hagar and Ishmael. In the following verses, Genesis chapter 21 verses 16 through 21, God heard the cry of the boy and spoke to Hagar, promising to make a great nation of Ishmael. God then opened her eyes, and she saw a well of water, enabling her to refresh Ishmael and herself. This passage highlights God's compassion and care for the marginalized and oppressed. Despite the circumstances, God did not abandon Hagar and Ishmael but provided for them in their moment of distress. It also emphasizes the importance of faith and trust in God's provision, even in the midst of dire circumstances. In summary, Genesis chapter 21 verse 15 recounts the moment when Hagar, facing dehydration in the wilderness, placed her son Ishmael under a shrub. This act symbolizes her despair and the intensity of their suffering. However, this verse also sets the stage for God's intervention and provision, highlighting His care for the vulnerable and marginalized. Genesis chapter 21 verse 16. And she went, and sat her down over against him a good way off, as it were a bowshot, for she said, Let me not see the death of the child. And she sat over against him, and lifted up her voice, and wept. This verse is part of the narrative in Genesis that recounts the story of Abraham, Sarah, and their son Isaac. It takes place after Sarah gave birth to Isaac, fulfilling God's promise to them despite their old age. In the preceding verses, we learn that Sarah became jealous of Hagar, her Egyptian maidservant, because Hagar had borne a child named Ishmael to Abraham. Sarah asked Abraham to cast out Hagar and Ishmael, and though this troubled Abraham, God reassured him and instructed him to do as Sarah had said. Genesis chapter 21 verse 16 specifically focuses on Hagar's perspective after being sent away by Abraham. Hagar found herself in a difficult and desperate situation. As she wandered in the wilderness, with limited provisions and no clear destination, her water supply eventually ran out. This dire circumstance led her to place her child, Ishmael, under a shrub and move away from him so that she would not witness his death. The phrase, and she went, and sat her down over against him a good way off, as it were a bowshot, indicates that Hagar positioned herself at a distance from Ishmael, presumably to spare herself the anguish of seeing him suffer or perish. It reflects the depth of her emotional distress and her longing for her son's well-being. Hagar's response reveals her vulnerability and her deep maternal love. In her desperation, she cries out to God, pleading for help and expressing her anguish through tears. This verse highlights the intense emotional turmoil experienced by Hagar as a mother in a desperate situation. Genesis chapter 21 verse 16 reminds us of the human emotions and struggles found within the biblical narratives. It showcases Hagar's distress and her reliance on God's intervention. This story also emphasizes God's compassion and care for the marginalized and those facing difficult circumstances. Overall, this verse presents an opportunity for reflection on themes such as faith, trust, compassion, and the challenges faced by individuals in desperate situations. Genesis chapter 21 verse 17. Genesis chapter 21 verse 17, KJV, And God heard the voice of the lad, and the angel of God called to Hagar out of heaven, and said unto her, What aileth thee, Hagar? Fear not, for God hath heard the voice of the lad where he is. This verse is part of the narrative of Hagar and Ishmael, who were sent away by Abraham at the request of Sarah after the birth of Isaac. After wandering in the wilderness, Hagar and Ishmael ran out of water and were in a desperate situation. Let's break down the verse and explore its significance. And God heard the voice of the lad. In their distress, Ishmael, the son of Abraham and Hagar, cried out to God. This verse highlights the compassion of God, who listens to the cries of those in need. It demonstrates God's concern for every individual, regardless of their circumstances. And the angel of God called to Hagar out of heaven. An angel of God speaks to Hagar, addressing her directly. Throughout the Bible, angels often serve as messengers of God, delivering His word and providing comfort or guidance. In this case, the angel brings a message of assurance and hope. What aileth thee, Hagar? Fear not, for God hath heard the voice of the lad where he is. The angel inquires about Hagar's distress and then assures her that there is no need to fear. The angel affirms that God has heard the voice of Ishmael, acknowledging his dire situation and the sincerity of his cry for help. This verse carries several significant themes and lessons. God's attentiveness. The verse emphasizes that God hears the prayers and cries of His people, even in the most desperate circumstances. It serves as a reminder that God is aware of our situations and is present to provide comfort and aid when we turn to Him. Divine intervention. The appearance of the angel to Hagar demonstrates God's active involvement in human affairs. Despite being cast out by Abraham and Sarah, Hagar and Ishmael were not abandoned by God. The intervention of the angel reveals God's care and His willingness to provide help in times of need. Overcoming fear. The angel's message to Hagar includes the instruction to fear not. This reassurance is a recurring theme in the Bible, reminding believers that God's presence and assistance should alleviate their fears. Hagar's experience teaches us that even in difficult circumstances, we can find solace in knowing that God is with us. Overall, Genesis chapter 21 verse 17 highlights the compassion of God, His attentiveness to our cries, and His desire to alleviate our fears. It also underscores the importance of turning to God in times of need and trusting in His provision. Genesis chapter 21 verse 18. Arise, lift up the lad, and hold him in thine hand, for I will make him a great nation. This verse is part of the narrative of Abraham and Sarah, who were promised by God to become the parents of a great nation. In this particular passage, God speaks to Hagar, the mother of Abraham's son Ishmael. To better understand the context, we need to review the events leading up to this verse. Abraham and Sarah were advanced in years, and Sarah was unable to conceive a child. In their attempt to fulfill God's promise of descendants, Sarah gave her handmaid Hagar to Abraham as a wife, and Hagar bore a son named Ishmael. However, this arrangement caused tension within the household. Eventually, Sarah miraculously conceived and gave birth to Isaac, the promised child. When Isaac was weaned, Sarah noticed Ishmael mocking him, which upset her. She told Abraham to cast out Hagar and Ishmael, saying that Ishmael should not be an heir with her son Isaac. This decision distressed Abraham, but God reassured him and told him to listen to Sarah's words. Then, in Genesis chapter 21 verse 18, God speaks directly to Hagar, who is wandering in the wilderness with her son after being expelled from Abraham's household. The phrase, "Arise, lift up the lad, and hold him in thine hand," suggests that Hagar was feeling helpless and overwhelmed. God instructs her to take hold of her son and care for him. This indicates God's compassion and concern for Hagar and Ishmael, even though they are no longer part of Abraham's household. The latter part of the verse, "For I will make him a great nation," is a reaffirmation of God's promise. Despite the difficult circumstances Hagar and Ishmael face, God assures Hagar that Ishmael will become the father of a great nation. This promise highlights God's faithfulness and His plan for Ishmael's future. The story of Hagar and Ishmael demonstrates God's care for all people, regardless of their circumstances. Even when they were cast out, God did not abandon them. This passage also illustrates God's sovereignty and the fulfillment of His promises. Ishmael went on to become the father of the Ishmaelites, who were one of the 12 tribes of Arabia and played a significant role in history. Overall, Genesis chapter 21 verse 18 is a reminder of God's compassion, faithfulness, and the realization of His promises, even in challenging situations. Genesis chapter 21 verse 19. And God opened her eyes, and she saw a well of water, and she went, and filled the bottle with water, and gave the lad drink. This verse is a part of the narrative of Abraham, Sarah, and their son Isaac. It occurs after Sarah, who was previously barren, miraculously conceives and gives birth to Isaac in her old age. Sarah had initially doubted the possibility of having a child at such an advanced age, but God fulfilled His promise to Abraham and Sarah. In the preceding verses, Sarah became distressed and asked Abraham to cast out Hagar, her Egyptian maidservant, and her son Ishmael, whom Abraham had fathered earlier. God reassured Abraham that he would make a great nation out of Ishmael, but instructed him to listen to Sarah and send him away. In Genesis chapter 21 verses 14 through 16, Abraham obeyed God's command and sent Hagar and Ishmael into the wilderness with limited supplies of food and water. When their provisions ran out, Hagar, desperate and fearing for the life of her son, placed Ishmael under a shrub and distanced herself, not being able to bear witness to his suffering. It is at this point that Genesis chapter 21 verse 19 describes God's intervention. God opened Hagar's eyes, enabling her to see a well of water nearby. Hagar went to the well, filled her bottle with water, and gave Ishmael a drink, saving him from death due to dehydration. This verse highlights God's compassion and provision in times of need. Even in the wilderness, where there seemed to be no hope, God revealed a source of sustenance for Hagar and Ishmael. It emphasizes God's concern for the vulnerable and His willingness to intervene in dire circumstances. This passage also serves as a reminder that God's faithfulness extends to all people, regardless of their circumstances. Hagar and Ishmael, who were not the direct recipients of the covenant promises made to Abraham, experienced God's mercy and provision. It demonstrates that God's grace is not limited to a specific group of individuals but extends to all who call upon Him in faith. Furthermore, this incident foreshadows the future provision of water in the wilderness during the exodus of the Israelites from Egypt. Just as God provided water from a rock in the desert to quench the thirst of the Israelites, here He provides water from a well to save Hagar and Ishmael. It serves as a reminder that God can bring forth sustenance and deliverance even in the most arid and challenging circumstances. In conclusion, Genesis chapter 21 verse 19 showcases God's compassionate intervention and provision in the life of Hagar and Ishmael. It highlights His care for the vulnerable and serves as a testament to His faithfulness and grace, even in the most desolate places. Genesis chapter 21 verse 20. And God was with the lad. And he grew, and dwelt in the wilderness, and became an archer. This verse is part of the narrative about the birth of Isaac, the promised son of Abraham and Sarah. It comes after the incident where Hagar, Sarah's maidservant, and her son Ishmael were sent away by Abraham at Sarah's request. Let's explore the significance and themes found in this verse. God's presence. The verse begins by highlighting God's presence with Ishmael, the lad, referring to Ishmael. Despite being separated from his father, Ishmael was not abandoned by God. This demonstrates God's faithfulness and care, even in difficult circumstances. It reminds us that God's presence can be with us, providing guidance, protection, and comfort, regardless of our situation. Growth and development. The verse states that Ishmael grew. This growth encompasses both physical and spiritual aspects. Physically, as Ishmael matured, he became stronger and capable of surviving in the wilderness. Spiritually, God's presence likely influenced Ishmael's character and relationship with God. This emphasizes the importance of growth and development in our own lives, both in terms of our abilities and our spiritual walk with God. Dwelling in the wilderness. Ishmael's dwelling in the wilderness is significant. It reflects his separation from the comforts and security of settled life, as well as the challenges he faced in this unfamiliar and harsh environment. This may symbolize the hardships and trials we encounter in our own lives. Even in such difficult circumstances, God can be with us, enabling us to navigate through life's challenges. Becoming an archer, the verse concludes by stating that Ishmael became an archer. This description suggests that Ishmael developed a skill or proficiency in archery. Archery was a valuable skill in ancient times, used for hunting, protection, and warfare. Ishmael's growth as an archer can symbolize his ability to survive and thrive in the wilderness. Additionally, it may also represent his ability to protect and provide for himself and his descendants. Overall, Genesis chapter 21 verse 20 highlights God's continued presence and care for Ishmael, despite his separation from his father and dwelling in the wilderness. It emphasizes the themes of growth, resilience, and God's faithfulness in challenging circumstances. As readers, we can draw lessons from this verse, recognizing that even in difficult times, God is with us, guiding our growth and equipping us to overcome the challenges we face. Genesis chapter 21 verse 21. And he dwelt in the wilderness of Paran, and his mother took him a wife out of the land of Egypt. This verse is part of the narrative about the life of Ishmael, the son of Abraham and Hagar. To understand the context of this verse, it is important to examine the preceding events. In Genesis chapter 21, Sarah, Abraham's wife, becomes jealous of Hagar, her maidservant, who had conceived and given birth to Ishmael. Sarah had previously given her maidservant to Abraham to bear a child, as she was unable to conceive. However, after Sarah miraculously conceives and gives birth to Isaac, tensions arise between Sarah and Hagar. Sarah approaches Abraham and insists that Hagar and Ishmael be sent away. Abraham is reluctant but receives divine confirmation from God to listen to Sarah. Reluctantly, he sends Hagar and Ishmael into the wilderness. Verse 21 provides a brief summary of Ishmael's dwelling place after he and his mother were sent away. It says that he dwelt in the wilderness of Paran. The wilderness of Paran was a region located in the northern part of the Sinai Peninsula, bordering Egypt. This area was known for its desert conditions. The second part of the verse states that Ishmael's mother took a wife for him from the land of Egypt. This indicates that Hagar arranged a marriage for Ishmael with an Egyptian woman. Marriages were often arranged by parents during this time period and were significant for establishing family connections and securing social and economic stability. This verse sheds light on the life and future of Ishmael. Despite being sent away from Abraham's household, God does not abandon Ishmael and his mother. God continues to watch over them and bless them, fulfilling the promise he made to Abraham regarding Ishmael's descendants becoming a great nation. Genesis chapter 21 verse 13. It is worth noting that Ishmael, as the father of the Arab nations, holds significant historical and cultural importance in the Middle East. This verse highlights the connection between Ishmael and Egypt, as his wife comes from that land. Overall, Genesis chapter 21 verse 21 provides a brief account of Ishmael's dwelling place in the wilderness of Paran and the arrangement of his marriage to an Egyptian woman by his mother, Hagar. It serves as a reminder of God's faithfulness and fulfillment of his promises, even in the midst of challenging circumstances. Genesis chapter 21 verse 22. And it came to pass at that time, that Abimelech and Phicol the chief captain of his host spake unto Abraham, saying, God is with thee in all that thou doest. This verse is part of the narrative in Genesis that focuses on Abraham and his interactions with various individuals and nations. Let's dive into the context and explore the significance of this verse. Genesis chapter 21 recounts the birth of Isaac, the long-awaited son of Abraham and Sarah. After Isaac's birth, tensions arose between Sarah and Hagar, the mother of Ishmael, who was Abraham's son through Sarah's servant. Eventually, Sarah insisted that Hagar and Ishmael be sent away, and Abraham, troubled by this, sought guidance from God. In the midst of these events, Abimelech, the king of Gerar, and Phicol, the commander of his army, approached Abraham. The verse tells us that they spoke to Abraham and acknowledged that God was with him in all that he did. This encounter between Abimelech, Phicol, and Abraham serves as a significant moment in the larger narrative of Abraham's life. Firstly, it demonstrates that Abraham's faithfulness to God had made an impression on the surrounding nations. Abimelech and Phicol recognized that God was with Abraham, indicating that Abraham's relationship with God had become evident and influential even to the leaders of other nations. Secondly, this encounter provides a glimpse into the integrity of Abraham's character. Despite his flaws and occasional lapses in trust, Abraham consistently sought to honor God and follow his commands. His actions and faithfulness stood out, prompting the acknowledgement of God's presence in Abraham's life by Abimelech and Phicol. Moreover, this verse highlights an important theme in the book of Genesis: God's faithfulness to his promises. God had made a covenant with Abraham, promising to bless him and make him a great nation. Genesis chapter 12 verse 1 through verse 3. Throughout the narrative, we see God's faithfulness to his covenant, as Abraham's descendants increase, and Isaac is born as a fulfillment of God's promise. In conclusion, Genesis chapter 21 verse 22 serves as a reminder of Abraham's faithfulness, the impact of his relationship with God on others, and the fulfillment of God's promises. It encourages us to reflect on the significance of our own faithfulness to God and how it can influence those around us, ultimately pointing them to the presence and faithfulness of God in our lives. Genesis chapter 21 verse 23. Now, therefore, swear unto me here by God that thou wilt not deal falsely with me, nor with my son, nor with my son's son, but according to the kindness that I have done unto thee, thou shalt do unto me, and to the land wherein thou hast sojourned. In this verse, we find Abraham engaging in a dialogue with Abimelech, the king of Gerar. To fully understand the context, it is helpful to consider the events leading up to this conversation. Earlier in Genesis chapter 20, Abraham and Sarah, his wife, had traveled to Gerar during a time of famine. Fearing for his life, Abraham had presented Sarah as his sister instead of his wife, which led Abimelech to take Sarah into his household. However, before anything happened between Abimelech and Sarah, God appeared to Abimelech in a dream, warning him that Sarah was Abraham's wife and instructing him to return her. Upon waking, Abimelech confronted Abraham, questioning him about his actions and rebuking him for potentially bringing guilt upon his kingdom. Abraham explained his reasoning, mentioning that he thought there was no fear of God in Gerar and that he and Sarah had indeed shared a family relationship. Despite this, Abraham had acted deceptively, and Abimelech returned Sarah to him and provided restitution for the misunderstanding. Genesis chapter 21 verse 23 occurs after these events, when Abimelech seeks reassurance from Abraham that he will deal honestly and kindly with him and his descendants. Abimelech requests that Abraham swear an oath before God, promising not to deal falsely with him, his son, or his son's son. He further emphasizes that Abraham should treat him and the land of Gerar with the same kindness that Abimelech had shown to him during their encounter. This exchange reveals several important aspects. The importance of honesty and integrity. Abimelech recognizes the need for trust and honesty in their relationship. He asks Abraham to swear by God, indicating the gravity of the matter. This underscores the significance of maintaining integrity and truthfulness in our dealings with others. The principle of reciprocity. Abimelech references the kindness he had shown to Abraham by returning Sarah and providing restitution. He expects the same level of kindness and fairness in return. This principle of reciprocity reminds us of the importance of treating others as we would like to be treated. The recognition of God's presence. Abimelech's request for Abraham to swear by God highlights the acknowledgement of God's involvement in their lives. It indicates that God's presence and authority are recognized by both Abraham and Abimelech. This passage presents a valuable lesson about the importance of honesty, integrity, and treating others with kindness. It reminds us that our actions have consequences, and we should strive to maintain a consistent character that reflects godly virtues. Furthermore, it encourages us to recognize God's presence in our lives and to honor Him in all our interactions with others. Genesis chapter 21 verse 24. And Abraham said, I will swear. Genesis chapter 21 verse 24 is a short verse that is part of the narrative of Abraham and Abimelech. To better understand the significance of this verse, it is helpful to consider the broader context of the passage. In Genesis chapter 20, we find that Abraham journeyed to Gerar, a place ruled by a king named Abimelech. However, out of fear, Abraham introduced his wife Sarah as his sister to protect himself. Abimelech took Sarah into his household, but God intervened in a dream and warned him that Sarah was actually Abraham's wife. Consequently, Abimelech returned Sarah to Abraham and confronted him about the deception. In Genesis chapter 21, we see the continuation of the story. Sarah, who was barren, miraculously conceives and gives birth to Isaac, the long-awaited child of promise. When Isaac was weaned, Abraham held a great feast to celebrate. During the celebration, Sarah noticed Ishmael, the son of Hagar, mocking Isaac. This upset Sarah, and she requested that Abraham cast out Hagar and her son from their household. Abraham was initially troubled by this, but God assured him that he would also make a great nation out of Ishmael. In Genesis chapter 21 verses 22 through 34, we come to the encounter between Abraham and Abimelech mentioned in verse 24. Abimelech, accompanied by Phicol, the chief captain of his army, approached Abraham and expressed a desire to make a covenant with him. Abimelech recognized that God was with Abraham in all that he did and desired to establish a peaceful relationship between their peoples. In response to Abimelech's proposal, Abraham agreed to make an oath or swear. This demonstrates Abraham's willingness to enter into a covenant and affirm the mutual trust between them. This covenant involved a well that Abraham had dug and claimed as his own, but he wanted to ensure that there would be no future disputes over its ownership. Abraham's willingness to swear shows his integrity and desire to maintain peaceful relations with his neighbors. It also reflects his trust in God's promises and blessings. By making an oath, Abraham solidified the covenant between himself and Abimelech, ensuring the security of the well. This verse reminds us of the importance of honesty, integrity, and maintaining good relationships with others. Abraham's actions in this passage provide an example of how believers should strive to live with others in peace, honoring agreements and acting with integrity. Ultimately, this story highlights God's faithfulness to His promises, even in the midst of challenging circumstances. Overall, Genesis chapter 21 verse 24 serves as a reminder of the significance of trust, honesty, and maintaining harmonious relationships, both with God and with our fellow human beings. Genesis chapter 21 verse 25. And Abraham reproved Abimelech because of a well of water, which Abimelech's servants had violently taken away. This verse is part of the narrative in the book of Genesis that recounts the life of Abraham, the patriarch of Israel and a central figure in the Bible. Let's delve into this passage and explore its significance. In Genesis chapter 21, we find Abraham and his wife Sarah in the land of Gerar, ruled by Abimelech, the king of the Philistines. This chapter begins with the fulfillment of God's promise to Abraham and Sarah, despite their old age, that they would bear a son named Isaac. Isaac's birth brings joy and laughter to Sarah, as she had previously been barren. The verse you mentioned, Genesis chapter 21 verse 25, occurs in the context of a dispute over a well of water. Wells were crucial in ancient times as a source of water, essential for survival and the well-being of both people and livestock. In this instance, Abimelech's servants had seized a well that rightfully belonged to Abraham. Abraham, in response, reproved Abimelech for this act of aggression. The word reproved indicates that Abraham confronted Abimelech and expressed his displeasure or disapproval regarding the situation. As the land they both resided in was Abimelech's domain, Abraham felt the need to address the issue with the king. This passage reveals a couple of important aspects. Firstly, it demonstrates Abraham's firm belief in his rights as a resident and a visitor in the land of Gerar. Though he was a sojourner, he expected fair treatment and was willing to challenge the king when he felt wronged. Secondly, this account highlights the importance of access to water sources, which were often contested in the arid regions of the ancient Near East. Water was a valuable resource, and control over wells often carried economic and political significance. Abraham's confrontation with Abimelech over the well underscores the importance of access to water and the ownership rights associated with it. Furthermore, this passage also reflects the broader theme of God's faithfulness to his promises. Despite the challenges and conflicts that Abraham faced, God's blessing was still evident in his life. Isaac's birth was a testament to God's faithfulness, and Abraham's insistence on securing his rightful access to the well may be seen as a continuation of his journey of faith and trust in God's provision. In summary, Genesis chapter 21 verse 25 recounts Abraham reproving Abimelech over the seizure of a well of water. This incident emphasizes Abraham's determination to assert his rights, the significance of water in ancient societies, and the ongoing fulfillment of God's promises in Abraham's life. Genesis chapter 21 verse 26. And Abimelech said, I wot not who hath done this thing, neither didst thou tell me, neither yet heard I of it, but today. In this verse, we find Abimelech, the king of Gerar, speaking to Abraham. To fully grasp the context, let's examine the surrounding verses as well. In Genesis chapter 21, we witness the fulfillment of God's promise to Abraham and Sarah in their old age, the birth of their son, Isaac. However, tensions arose when Sarah noticed Ishmael, Abraham's son through Hagar, mocking Isaac. In response to Sarah's distress, Abraham was compelled to send Hagar and Ishmael away. God reassured Abraham that he would take care of Ishmael, and so they departed with some supplies. At this point, we reach Genesis chapter 21 verse 22, where Abimelech approaches Abraham with his commander, Phicol, to make a covenant. Abraham had previously resided in Gerar, where he had lied about Sarah being his sister instead of his wife. This deception resulted in Abimelech taking Sarah into his household, only to discover the truth through a divine warning from God. Abimelech returned Sarah to Abraham, and Abraham prayed for him, his wife, and his maidservants, as they were unable to conceive due to God's intervention. Now, in Genesis chapter 21 verse 26, Abimelech states that he had no knowledge of the events that transpired between Abraham and Sarah. He claims ignorance about Abraham's intentions to send Hagar and Ishmael away. Abimelech insists that he had not been informed by Abraham, nor had he heard of it until that day when they were having this conversation. Abimelech's response seems to indicate his genuine surprise and innocence regarding the matter. It shows that Abimelech was not involved in or aware of Abraham's decision to send Hagar and Ishmael away. His words may reflect a sense of bewilderment at the situation unfolding before him, possibly highlighting the lack of communication between Abimelech and Abraham. This verse also serves as a reminder of the importance of clear communication and honesty in our relationships. Misunderstandings and conflicts can arise when information is withheld or not effectively shared. Abraham's failure to inform Abimelech about his intentions resulted in confusion and potential tension between the two parties. Overall, Genesis chapter 21 verse 26 portrays Abimelech's surprise and lack of prior knowledge regarding Abraham's decision to send Hagar and Ishmael away. It serves as a reminder of the significance of open and honest communication to foster understanding and avoid misunderstandings in our relationships. Genesis chapter 21 verse 27. And Abraham took sheep and oxen, and gave them unto Abimelech, and both of them made a covenant. Context. To fully understand the significance of Genesis chapter 21 verse 27, it is important to consider the context of the passage. In this chapter, Abraham and Sarah have miraculously received their promised son, Isaac, in their old age. However, conflict arises when Sarah notices Ishmael, the son of Abraham and Hagar, mocking Isaac. As a result, Sarah insists that Abraham cast out Hagar and Ishmael. Reluctantly, Abraham complies, and they are sent away. In verse 22, Abraham makes a covenant with Abimelech, the king of Gerar, to secure his rights to a well. The significance of the livestock. In Genesis chapter 21 verse 27, Abraham presents sheep and oxen as gifts to Abimelech as they make a covenant. This act signifies Abraham's desire for peace and goodwill between himself and Abimelech. It also demonstrates Abraham's generosity and willingness to honor his commitments. The livestock offered could also be seen as a gesture of wealth and abundance, as sheep and oxen were valuable possessions in that era. The importance of the covenant. Making a covenant was a significant event in biblical times. It was a solemn agreement between two parties, often involving promises, commitments, and obligations. By making a covenant, Abraham and Abimelech solidify their relationship and establish terms for peace and cooperation. The exchange of gifts, in this case, the livestock, further strengthens the covenant and signifies mutual trust and goodwill. Abraham's character and faith. Genesis chapter 21 verse 27 reflects Abraham's character as a man of integrity and faith. Despite the previous conflicts and misunderstandings between Abraham and Abimelech, Abraham takes the initiative to reconcile and establish a covenant. His willingness to give valuable livestock exemplifies his trust in God's provision and his desire to maintain peaceful relationships with others. Lessons for us. Genesis chapter 21 verse 27 teaches us several valuable lessons. Firstly, it emphasizes the importance of resolving conflicts and seeking reconciliation. Abraham's actions demonstrate the need for peaceful resolutions and the pursuit of harmony with others. Secondly, the passage highlights the significance of honoring commitments and maintaining trust in relationships. Abraham's fulfillment of his promise and his generous gifts serve as a model for our own faithfulness and integrity. Lastly, the passage reminds us of God's faithfulness in providing for his people. Abraham's act of giving reflects his trust in God's provision and serves as a reminder for us to rely on God's abundance and generosity in our own lives. Overall, Genesis chapter 21 verse 27 showcases Abraham's character, his commitment to maintaining peaceful relationships, and the significance of covenants in biblical times. It encourages us to seek reconciliation, honor our commitments, and trust in God's provision. Genesis chapter 21 verse 28. And Abraham set 7 ewe lambs of the flock by themselves. This verse is a part of the narrative in the book of Genesis that describes an event involving Abraham, Sarah, and Abimelech, the king of Gerar. Let's delve into the context and meaning of this verse and its significance within the broader story. In Genesis chapter 21, we find Abraham and Sarah, who were advanced in age, experiencing the fulfillment of God's promise to them. Sarah miraculously conceives and gives birth to Isaac, their long-awaited son and the heir of God's covenant promises. However, conflict arises when Ishmael, Abraham's son with Hagar, Sarah's maidservant, begins to mock Isaac. This prompts Sarah to request that Abraham send Hagar and Ishmael away. In response to this request, God assures Abraham that he will also make a great nation from Ishmael, as he is Abraham's son. Trusting in God's promise, Abraham rises early in the morning and provides Hagar with bread and a bottle of water and sends her and Ishmael away into the wilderness. Following this event, Abraham enters into a covenant with Abimelech, the king of Gerar. They make an agreement concerning a well of water that Abimelech's servants had seized from Abraham's servants. After the covenant is established, Abraham presents 7 ewe lambs, separating them from the rest of the flock, and sets them aside. The significance of Abraham separating 7 ewe lambs from the flock lies in the cultural context of the time. In biblical times, animals were often used in the making of covenants as symbols of commitment and mutual trust. The act of setting aside these 7 lambs served as a visible representation of the covenant between Abraham and Abimelech, signifying their agreement and peaceful coexistence. Furthermore, The number 7 holds special significance throughout the Bible, often representing completeness and perfection. In this context, the 7 ewe lambs may symbolize the completeness and sincerity of the covenant made between Abraham and Abimelech, emphasizing the seriousness and integrity of their agreement. As we reflect on Genesis chapter 21 verse 28, we can draw several lessons from this passage. First, it teaches us about the importance of honoring our commitments and being trustworthy in our relationships with others. Abraham's act of separating the lambs demonstrates his commitment to maintaining peaceful relations with Abimelech and upholding his part of the covenant. Secondly, this verse reminds us of the faithfulness of God in fulfilling His promises. Despite the challenges and conflicts that arose, God remained faithful to His covenant with Abraham and Sarah, eventually blessing them with the birth of Isaac. It serves as a testament to God's sovereignty and His ability to bring about His plans and promises, even in the midst of difficult circumstances. In summary, Genesis chapter 21 verse 28 recounts Abraham's act of setting aside 7 ewe lambs as part of a covenant with Abimelech, symbolizing their commitment and mutual trust. This passage reminds us of the significance of honoring our commitments and highlights God's faithfulness in fulfilling His promises. Genesis chapter 21 verse 29. And Abimelech said unto Abraham, What mean these 7 ewe lambs which thou hast set by themselves? This verse is part of the narrative that describes the interaction between Abraham and Abimelech, the king of Gerar, regarding a well of water. To better understand the significance of this verse, let's examine the context of Genesis chapter 21 verse 29. In the preceding verses, we learn that Abraham had entered into a covenant with Abimelech, in which they agreed to deal kindly with one another. Abraham complained to Abimelech about a well that his servants had seized, leading to a dispute over water rights. After a resolution was reached, Abimelech noticed the 7 ewe lambs that Abraham had set apart. In this conversation, Abimelech seeks clarification from Abraham about the purpose or meaning behind the 7 ewe lambs. It is important to note that the number 7 often carries symbolic significance in the Bible, representing completeness or fullness. Additionally, in the biblical culture, the offering of livestock was a common practice to signify a covenant or agreement between parties. Abimelech's question regarding the 7 ewe lambs demonstrates his curiosity and desire for understanding. It also suggests that he recognized these lambs as significant and wanted Abraham to explain their purpose or significance in relation to their covenant. By asking this question, Abimelech reveals his observant nature and his willingness to engage in open dialogue with Abraham. Abraham's response to Abimelech's question is recorded in the following verses, where he explains that the 7 ewe lambs were a witness or testimony of his ownership of the well. By presenting these lambs, Abraham intended to establish a lasting confirmation of their agreement regarding the well's ownership. From this passage, we can draw a few key lessons. Firstly, open and honest communication is crucial in resolving conflicts and misunderstandings. Abimelech's inquiry and Abraham's explanation demonstrate the importance of clear dialogue in maintaining healthy relationships. Secondly, the act of setting apart the 7 ewe lambs illustrates the significance of symbolic gestures in making covenants or agreements. Abraham's deliberate separation of these lambs serves as a tangible reminder of their agreement, creating a visual representation of the commitment made between Abraham and Abimelech. Lastly, this passage highlights the value of witnessing or testifying to the agreements and commitments we make. By providing a visible and tangible symbol of the covenant, Abraham ensures that there is a concrete reminder of the agreement, making it easier for future generations or any other witnesses to remember and uphold their commitment. In conclusion, Genesis chapter 21 verse 29 recounts Abimelech's inquiry to Abraham regarding the 7 ewe lambs set apart. This verse emphasizes the importance of clear communication, the significance of symbolic gestures in making covenants, and the value of witnessing or testifying to agreements. These lessons can be applied to our own lives as we seek to foster healthy relationships and maintain the commitments we make with others. Genesis chapter 21 verse 30. And he said, For these 7 ewe lambs shalt thou take of my hand, that they may be a witness unto me, that I have digged this well. Context: Genesis chapter 21 verse 30 is part of the story of Abraham and Abimelech. In this chapter, Abraham and Sarah have a son named Isaac in their old age, and Sarah insists that Abraham send away Hagar and her son Ishmael, born to Abraham through Sarah's maidservant. Later, Abraham makes a covenant with Abimelech, the king of Gerar, regarding a well that Abraham had dug. The dispute over the well. The verse refers to a dispute over a well that Abraham had dug. The Philistines, represented by Abimelech, claimed the well as their own. Abraham, seeking a resolution, proposes a covenant with Abimelech. As a witness to the covenant, Abraham offers 7 ewe lambs, symbolizing the commitment and sincerity of his claim to the well. Symbolism of the 7 ewe lambs. The 7 ewe lambs serve as a tangible representation of Abraham's honesty and integrity. In biblical times, animals were often used as witnesses or as symbols of an agreement. By offering the 7 ewe lambs, Abraham is emphasizing that he is the one who dug the well and that he has a rightful claim to it. Importance of the well. Wells were crucial in the ancient Near East, providing a vital source of water for both humans and animals. This particular well had been dug by Abraham and was an important asset for his livestock and his community. By asserting his ownership through the covenant and the witness of the ewe lambs, Abraham secures his rights to the well. Lessons and applications. This passage highlights several important principles. Honesty and integrity. Abraham's actions demonstrate the importance of honesty and integrity in resolving conflicts. He uses the 7 ewe lambs as a witness to prove his claim, showing his commitment to truthfulness and righteousness. Seeking peaceful resolutions. Abraham's willingness to enter into a covenant with Abimelech reveals his desire for peaceful resolutions. Instead of engaging in a violent confrontation or escalating the dispute, Abraham proposes a peaceful agreement that would benefit both parties. God's provision. Throughout the narrative, we see God's faithfulness in providing for Abraham and his descendants. The fact that Abraham had access to water in the form of a well demonstrates God's provision and care for his people, even in difficult circumstances. Importance of possessions. This passage also reminds us of the significance of material possessions. The well was a valuable asset for Abraham, and he took necessary steps to protect his rights to it. It serves as a reminder that we should be good stewards of the resources and blessings that God has entrusted to us. Overall, Genesis chapter 21 verse 30 teaches us lessons about honesty, peaceful resolutions, and God's provision. It also reminds us of the importance of being good stewards of the blessings we receive. Genesis chapter 21 verse 31. And therefore he called that place Beersheba, because there they swear both of them. This verse is part of the narrative of Abraham and Abimelech making a covenant at Beersheba. Let's explore the context and significance of this passage. In Genesis chapter 20, Abraham had journeyed to Gerar, where he encountered Abimelech, the king of the Philistines. Out of fear, Abraham had lied about his relationship with Sarah, claiming that she was his sister, not his wife. As a result, Abimelech took Sarah into his household. However, before he could touch her, God appeared to Abimelech in a dream and warned him of the consequences of taking another man's wife. Abimelech, acting in innocence, returned Sarah to Abraham and rebuked him for deceiving him. In Genesis chapter 21, we see the birth of Isaac, the son promised to Abraham and Sarah by God despite their old age. Ishmael, Abraham's son through Hagar, Sarah's maidservant, was already born. As Isaac grew, tensions arose between Sarah and Hagar, leading to Hagar and Ishmael being sent away into the wilderness at Sarah's insistence. In the latter part of Genesis chapter 21, Abraham and Abimelech meet again. Abimelech, along with Phicol, the captain of his army, visit Abraham. This time, Abimelech expresses his desire for a covenant with Abraham, recognizing that God is with him in everything he does. Abraham agrees to the proposal and reproaches Abimelech for seizing a well that belonged to Abraham's servants. To settle the matter, Abraham brings forth 7 ewe lambs, signifying a formal agreement between them. Genesis chapter 21 verse 31 is the conclusion of this interaction. Abraham names the place of their covenant, Beersheba, which means, well of the oath, or well of the 7. The name reflects the 7 lambs that were presented as part of the covenant. The significance of this name change is twofold. Firstly, it serves as a lasting testament to the covenant between Abraham and Abimelech, marking the location as a place of agreement and peace. Secondly, it signifies the abundance and blessing of water provided through the restored well. The act of swearing an oath or making a covenant was a significant cultural practice in the ancient Near East. By swearing an oath, parties would commit themselves to fulfilling their promises and abiding by the terms of the agreement. In this case, Abraham and Abimelech made a covenant as a testament to their mutual trust and peaceful coexistence. This passage emphasizes the importance of honesty, integrity, and trust in human relationships. It also highlights God's faithfulness to His promises, as Isaac's birth and the restoration of the well are evidence of God's provision and guidance in Abraham's life. Ultimately, Genesis chapter 21 verse 31 reminds us of the significance of making and honoring commitments, fostering peace, and relying on God's faithfulness in our interactions with others. Genesis chapter 21 verse 32. Thus they made a covenant at Beersheba. Then Abimelech rose up, and Phicol the chief captain of his host, and they returned into the land of the Philistines. Context: Genesis chapter 21 verse 32 is part of the narrative surrounding Abraham's interactions with Abimelech, the king of Gerar. Prior to this verse, Abraham and Abimelech had made a covenant regarding a well that had been seized by Abimelech's servants. In response to Abraham's complaint, Abimelech returns the well to Abraham, signifying their peaceful agreement. Covenant: the verse emphasizes that a covenant was made at Beersheba. In biblical times, a covenant was a solemn agreement or contract between two parties, often sealed with an oath. In this case, the covenant solidified the resolution of the dispute over the well, establishing peace and mutual understanding between Abraham and Abimelech. Beersheba holds significance throughout the Bible as an important location. It was a prominent city in the territory of the Philistines and was frequently associated with Abraham. Beersheba serves as a boundary marker between the territories of different tribes, highlighting its strategic and symbolic importance. Abimelech and Phicol: Abimelech was the king of Gerar, and Phicol was his chief captain. Their presence during the covenant ceremony demonstrates their commitment to upholding the agreement and ensures that it carries weight and authority. Their participation also signifies the involvement of the entire Philistine community. Return to the land of the Philistines. After making the covenant, Abimelech and Phicol returned to their homeland, the land of the Philistines. This emphasizes the restoration of peaceful relations between Abraham and Abimelech, allowing both parties to resume their respective lives and territories. Lessons from Genesis chapter 21 verse 32. Resolving conflicts through peaceful agreements. The covenant made between Abraham and Abimelech serves as an example of resolving disputes and conflicts through peaceful negotiations rather than resorting to violence. It highlights the importance of seeking reconciliation and understanding with others. Honoring commitments. The fact that both Abimelech and Phicol participated in the covenant ceremony illustrates the significance of honoring commitments and upholding one's word. It serves as a reminder to be people of integrity and to fulfill our promises and agreements. Establishing peace. The covenant at Beersheba demonstrates the desire for peace and harmony between different communities. It reminds us of the importance of fostering goodwill and building bridges of understanding with others, even in the face of past disagreements. God's guidance and sovereignty. Throughout the story, we see God's providence in preserving Abraham and leading him in his interactions with Abimelech. This passage reminds us that God is sovereign and actively involved in the affairs of his people, guiding them to resolutions that align with His purposes. In summary, Genesis chapter 21 verse 32 captures the moment when Abraham and Abimelech make a covenant at Beersheba, signifying the resolution of their dispute and the restoration of peaceful relations. This passage teaches us about the significance of peaceful resolutions, honoring commitments, pursuing peace, and recognizing God's guidance in our interactions with others. Genesis chapter 21 verse 33. And Abraham planted a grove in Beersheba, and called there on the name of the Lord, the everlasting God. Context. To better understand Genesis chapter 21 verse 33, let's examine the context of the verse. In Genesis chapter 21, we find the account of Abraham and Sarah, who were promised a son by God despite their old age. Isaac, the promised child, was born to them, bringing great joy and fulfillment of God's promise. However, a conflict arose between Sarah and Hagar, Ishmael's mother, resulting in Hagar and Ishmael being sent away. In the midst of these events, Abraham settles in Beersheba. Abraham's settlement in Beersheba. After Abraham settled in Beersheba, he planted a grove or a tamarisk tree and called on the name of the Lord. Beersheba became a significant place in Abraham's life, serving as a center of worship and a reminder of God's faithfulness. This act of planting the grove and invoking the name of the Lord signifies Abraham's acknowledgement and worship of God in that place. Calling on the name of the Lord. The phrase, "called there on the name of the Lord," implies an act of worship and devotion. Throughout the Bible, calling on the name of the Lord often refers to prayer, praise, and seeking God's presence. It signifies a deepening of Abraham's relationship with God and his recognition of God as the everlasting God, the one who is eternal and unchanging. The everlasting God. The title, "The Everlasting God," emphasizes God's eternal nature and unending faithfulness. It highlights His ability to fulfill His promises and His enduring presence throughout all generations. Abraham's recognition of God's everlasting nature reflects his growing understanding of God's character and the depth of his faith. Application. As we reflect on Genesis chapter 21 verse 33, we can draw a few important lessons for our own lives. First, like Abraham, we should find places of worship and set aside time to call upon the name of the Lord. Regularly engaging in prayer and seeking God's presence helps us deepen our relationship with Him. Second, just as Abraham acknowledged God as the everlasting God, we should remember that God's faithfulness extends beyond our circumstances. He remains constant and steadfast, even in the midst of life's challenges and changes. Trusting in God's everlasting nature brings us peace and reassurance. Lastly, Abraham's act of worship and recognition of God's eternal nature serves as a reminder for us to continually honor and praise God for who He is. He is deserving of our worship and devotion. In conclusion, Genesis chapter 21 verse 33 highlights Abraham's act of worship in Beersheba and his acknowledgement of God as the everlasting God. This verse encourages us to seek God's presence, recognize His eternal nature, and respond with heartfelt worship and devotion. Genesis chapter 21 verse 34. And Abraham sojourned in the Philistines' land many days. This verse concludes the account of Abraham's interaction with Abimelech, the king of the Philistines. To fully understand the significance of this verse, it's important to examine the surrounding context. In Genesis chapter 20 verse 1 to 20, we find Abraham and Sarah temporarily dwelling in Gerar, which was a region under the dominion of the Philistines. Fearing for his life because of Sarah's beauty, Abraham had presented her as his sister to Abimelech, just as he had done before with Pharaoh in Egypt, Genesis chapter 12 verse 10 to 20. God intervened to protect Sarah and Abimelech, appearing to the Philistine king in a dream and warning him of the consequences of taking Sarah as his wife. Abimelech, unaware of the true nature of Abraham and Sarah's relationship, returned Sarah to Abraham and provided them with livestock, servants, and land as a sign of reconciliation. Genesis chapter 21 verse 34 serves as a summary statement, indicating that Abraham and his family resided in the land of the Philistines for an extended period. This period likely covered the time after the birth of Isaac and before their relocation to Beersheba, which occurs in the subsequent chapter, Genesis chapter 22. While this verse may not contain explicit theological or moral teachings, it reveals Abraham's journey and the providence of God in preserving him and Sarah during their sojourn in a foreign land. It highlights God's faithfulness and protection even in difficult circumstances and serves as a bridge to the subsequent events in Abraham's life. Overall, the verse emphasizes the historical context and helps establish the timeline of Abraham's life while preparing the narrative for the subsequent events in Genesis. It reminds readers of God's guiding presence and the fulfillment of His promises to Abraham.